We've seen a lot of news regarding the Resident Evil 4 remake, but something that hasn't been touched up on a lot by Capcom is the map itself. Now, we've gotten bits and pieces and some good images of the map itself, but it's never been heavily talked about by many people. So what I'd like to do today is compare the original map from Resident Evil 4 to the new remake of Resident Evil 4. See what's new, see what's different, see what's the same. So starting off, I think the first area that should be looked at is, of course, the first area of Resident Evil 4. Now, in the original game, this area before the main village section was not too big. You probably spent like maybe 10 minutes on this section. Probably a lot less. And if you know a lot about the game, you spend maybe 2 minutes here. The first thing that's very clear when comparing the old with the new is that there's some pretty noticeable changes. Some very noticeable changes. Like, first off, the first building you enter in the original game is a lot further down than it used to be. In fact, in the original game, it was right there. It seems as though in the remake, you're going to be walking a little bit before you reach the first building, which has now been called the Hunter's Lodge, so I'll just refer to it as that for now. So you can also make a pretty quick observation that the Hunter's Lodge is a lot bigger than it used to be. In the original game, it was like 3 rooms. In the remake, yeah, it's a lot bigger. I can't exactly make out how many rooms, but if we take a look at the walls, at least how the walls are, lined up, it's probably around 10 rooms when counting the basement. So that's a pretty big change. It's also just very clear how much longer this beginning section is compared to the original, which I'm a pretty big fan of that change. That original trek through the woods was one of the most atmospheric and creepy parts of the game. It was one of my favorite parts of the game, easily top 5. So I'm glad that it's getting extended out. Another little thing I noticed is that there might be another building that we have to pass through right here. They look like 2 boxes conjoined by a little strip there. So that might be another building that we have to pass through. Certainly not as big as the Hunter's Lodge, but who knows what's there. I have a feeling that somewhere in this area might be that one section that we saw in one of the first trailers, where Leon sees the dead dog and a few dilapidated buildings. Possibly might be this area. Alright, now let's talk about the village square, which surprisingly is the area with the least amount of changes. It's actually pretty accurate to the original. If we compare the two, they line up pretty well. The key differences I noticed right off the bat is that barn is also highlighted in the village square, the remake. So that might mean that you can enter the big barn this time around. In the original, you couldn't do that. In the original game, it was just a blacked out square. So it being highlighted has me pretty excited to see that this will actually be an enterable building in the main campaign rather than just being only enterable in the mercenaries mode, which is how it was in the original game. One of the most noticeable changes for people like me who've played this game a million times is this weird little extra bit of land right here left of that one shack that's to the right of the village entrance that appears to connect to the shack now. This wasn't here originally. This little dong-shaped area. Pretty interesting. I guess it just adds a little bit of extra maneuverability around the village square, which is cool with me. Another interesting thing of note is that there's a noticeable gap between the tiny barn and the house in the bottom right. That wasn't there before in the original game. It might look like there is one in the original map, but there wasn't. In the trailers, I think there was a gap between the two that we could have easily made out. I'd have to double check on that, but that just adds a bit more extra maneuverability and area to walk around. A very unnoticeable change until you zoom in is this ladder that appears behind the bottom right house that takes you down to what seems to be a cave area where the exit is right next to the town hall. In the original game, there was not a cave section in the village square. So I don't know what could possibly be down in this cave area. Maybe some kind of treasures, or maybe some kind of different enemies. Who knows what's down there? All I know is I'm pretty excited. So far, it seems that we've only had expanded areas rather than cut areas, so that's a pretty good sign. I also believe this little circle, I guess you can call it, right here is probably the tower. And as for all these blacked out areas, I think these are places that are unenterable, or there are things that are blocking your path. In the newest trailer that we saw, or the gameplay that we saw that there was a bunch of debris outside one of the houses. It's possible that this is probably the tower, and that the tower collapses at some point. This little blacked out area behind the house you barricade yourself in is probably that destroyed balcony or wooden area, I guess, on the back of someone's house. We see Dr. Salvador chop it down, so that probably means that this area is now inaccessible or just is a roadblock in your way. So it'd probably be a smart idea to make sure to check what's up on that balcony before he chops it down. In the original game, that stretched around to the side of the house and you can find a spinel there. So make sure to go up there and grab the spinel before Dr. Salvador chops it down, making it unreachable. So far, I have to say I'm pretty impressed by what Capcom's shown us so far. Nothing seems to be outright cut, rather expanded upon. But let's see how long this goes on for. Starting off, I think we should go on to the farm area after the village section, because that's where you naturally head off to after the big village fight. A lot of the buildings here are the exact same. The two barns are here, and you might think the shack is gone, the shack that held the typewriter, but it just seems to have been moved. If we zoom in really close, we can see this little outline of a small building. I imagine this is probably the shack. Now, the thing that obviously looks different is the balcony area on the big farm. It seems to wrap around to the right into this big circle building, which we got a slight view of in the newest gameplay. In the original game, the balcony was right next to the barn and stretched straight out into a wooden wall area where there was a big giant gate that you boosted Ashley over to unlock it for you. It doesn't seem to be the same in the remake. It just looks more like a giant castle gate from what I could tell from the gameplay trailer, but it's still pretty much close enough. And it's not an outright change that looks like a bad design change. But one noticeable difference is that there's only one path extending from the farm. In the original game, there were two. One that led you off course to the cabin, which was inaccessible until much later in the game. And then another one that led you through just more woods to another little small area with buildings, and then to Louise Serra. That does not seem to be the case here. So it might be possible we go somewhere else after the village square. Where we go, I don't know. Or maybe we head to the cabin, or the villa as it's being called in the remake. Maybe we go there twice instead of once. Who knows? Since we're already really close to the cabin, or the villa, let's look at the area around it, shall we? Most notably is this little extra path that extends up and around the villa. What this is, I don't know. It's probably just more of that extra exploration element that Resident Evil 4's remake is going for, so probably some treasures and good loot lies back there. Who knows? Now, for those who know a lot about the original Resident Evil 4, there might be something really off. In the original Resident Evil 4, there were two paths that you could take after the cabin fight. One that led you to a second fight with an El Gigante, and one that led you to another big fight with Ganados. So those of you who know about that might be thinking, hey, where's the second path? Because we can only see one extending from the villa area. And that's what I thought at first too, but I look just below the villa, and there appears to be this little tiny pathway that cuts off right there. Now, it's still quite possible that there are two pathways, and we can see there's one pathway clearly highlighted, and then another right there that just hasn't been gone down yet. Or maybe it's just a dead end, who knows. But we can see buildings above the villa, and that first path that's highlighted doesn't lead up to them. So I think this little unexplored path will lead us to these extra buildings. And if we look further up from the villa where this possible second path could lead us, we can see this big jumble of buildings and almost industrial looking stuff, which is possibly the final area of the village. And if we look further right to that stuff, we can see the entrance to the castle. So it's very possible this little unexplored path leads us to these extra buildings in this new area and then lead us to the castle. It's very noticeable that there's no ski lift on the map that we can see like in the original game, but I have a feeling it's probably still there. We just can't quite see it because of how the map is laid out. Now let's talk about this path that is highlighted next to the villa, which doesn't really match anything from the original game at all. This little path leads to a few buildings and a dock that connects to the lake. In the original game, the cabin did not have any pathways that led to the lake at all. So this is a pretty big change. Who knows what could possibly be in this area? I have a feeling that maybe free roam or just exploration of the map might be a bigger thing for this remake. So it's possible that we walk across a lot of these areas multiple times over and venture out onto the lake multiple times. Since we're already pretty close to the lake, let's talk about the lake itself. So very noticeably, the lake is much bigger than it used to be. Like, a whole lot bigger. In the original game, there were only 3 areas you could venture to in the lake. The area after the fish farm, the small cave that held a merchant shop, and the dock that led you to the waterfall. In this game, we can make out 4 docks and 2 little inlets, 1 river that leads you down to this smaller pool near the church, and this one near the quarry, which seems to look pretty close to the merchant shop for the El Gigante fight. Also very noticeable in the lake is this little boat underneath the word lake. At first I just thought this was just a map indicator indicating that you use a boat, but if we zoom in, there appears to be rooms within this boat. So it's possible that you enter a boat on the lake, a bigger boat, and find good loot there, and possibly fight some enemies. This area reminds me a whole lot of the riverboat section of Resident Evil 5, which is a good thing because I love that section. That was my favorite chapter of Resident Evil 5. So this is pretty neat. And wait a second, looking at the map, I noticed one other thing that I just noticed. To the right of the boat, it's very hard to make out. To the right of the boat, it's very hard to make out, but there is another little highlighted area. A small pathway right here. What that leads to, I don't know. It's possible that this is the merchant cave, and this small cave shrine, sort of to the north of the boat, northeast, is something else completely. Everywhere else on the map that has a merchant shop is indicated on the map by a merchant icon, but this small cave shrine does not have one of those. So it's possible this small cave to the right of the lake is probably the merchant shop. Who knows? I'm just theorizing at this point. The next area I'd like to take a look at is the village chief's manor. In the original game, at the end of the first chapter, you rescue Luis Serra and you get transported to an area at the far south side of the map. You wake up in a small building, walk out into a giant quarry-like area, you traverse it, and then eventually make your way to a industrial factory kind of building. Now, at first glance, it doesn't seem to be here, this factory building or that big quarry. Well, there is a quarry right there to the right, but we'll get to that later. But the one at the start of chapter 1-2 doesn't seem to be here, same with its factory. But if we look very closely and zoom in, we can see what appears to be some kind of building right here. It looks to be industrial, so I think it's possible that this is the factory that we're seeing right here, right below the R3 button in the current orientation. Now, the village chief's manor appears to have a slightly different layout from the original, if we zoom in close on both. As of now, analyzing this part of the map is pretty difficult because they have shown very, very little of it. So I imagine there must be something pretty interesting going on down here for them to have shown us nothing of that area yet. Maybe it's where the demo will take place. So let's move on to another area, shall we? Let's go to the church area and everything beyond it, because it's pretty interesting what's going on over there. Okay, so if we go back to the main village square, enter the town hall, we can still see that we still get to the church through the town hall. Whether or not we're going through an underground cave system, I don't know. It doesn't really look like it's an underground cave system. It looks like it's a normal pathway. There's still a typewriter and a merchant in the town hall, which is still the same. The overall layout of the town hall seems a lot bigger. So it's possible there's an actual enemy encounter in the town hall now. And then we get to the church, and things seem pretty close to the original, for the most part. The graveyard's still here, and it looks roughly the same size. There's still that tiny little shack there. And then the church itself looks pretty close. In fact, it's very close. Now the images are flipped around slightly, but I think it's pretty safe to say the church might be a bit bigger. Possibly. Maybe. And we saw that in the gameplay trailer that the layout's slightly different, at least for the top floor area. It's slightly different, because there appears to be a ladder at the back of the church, which wasn't there, but there's also one at the side of the church. It's very hard to tell what's kind of going on because of how many markers are on the church. And there also appears to be a jewel symbol right there, which means there's probably treasure. It might be the green cat's eye that's at the back of the church in the original game. And then we follow the pathway next to the church, and yeah, it's pretty close for the most part. But one of the most noticeable things are these two ladders. They might lead to an upper part of this walkway or a lower part, or maybe it leads into a cave area. I don't know. Anyway, it's still pretty interesting. Moving past the church areas where things take a turn for some really crazy changes. Not bad ones, just very noticeable crazy changes. So it's kind of hard to tell what happens after this little scaffolding area, but it looks like it connects to this quarry area, which in the original game, this quarry area is where we fought the El Gigante. Now, it's really hard to make out what exactly is going on in this quarry area. It kind of looks like there's some scaffolding and wooden walkways. It's probably still the area where we fight the El Gigante, but it looks like it'll be a heck of a lot different. There's also a marker for a blue medallion here, which it was mentioned in the gameplay that there are more blue medallions and things to collect, so here's more proof of that. We walk up out of the quarry, and we get to a merchant shop, a typewriter, and there appears to be an emblem with two rifles clashing against each other, or overlaying each other. I don't quite know what this means. It might mean that this is a shooting range, which would be pretty interesting, because the shooting ranges started showing up in the castle, so they might show up earlier than they did before. And I'm pretty sure this is the same cave shop, because there's a dock to the right of the merchant area right there, and it looks like it probably connects, if we go further right, to this area, which I suspect is probably the waterfall area. Maybe. I don't know yet, but we'll get there eventually. Okay, so what's pretty interesting here is how the fish farm does not lead to the lake. In the original game, you go from the church to the quarry to the fish farm. Now, it still seems like you get to go through the quarry to get to the fish farm, but in the original game, the fish farm led to the lake. This time around, it does not. And there are also blue medallions in this fish farm. Now, what's pretty interesting about this fish farm is that at first, it might seem pretty different to the original. But if we take the original and the new one and just flip the new one, the wooden walkways share an almost identical design to them, which I thought was pretty interesting. But there also appears to be a few expansions, and whatever this is in the back, possibly a different building or something else. So I don't quite know what this means or what the fish farm has in store for us in this new version of the game, but I'm pretty excited. It also looks like there might be a small bridge we have to cross over to the fish farm, or to get to the fish farm, seeing as how there's this river that runs from the lake through the fish farm down to the church scaffolding area and to that small little pool below the church. Alright, so between the quarry and the fish farm is this dock, which appears to be on a different elevation because there are ladders that seem to lead down to it. So we go on to the dock, and then it leads us to the lake. And to the right of this dock area is another dock area. I have a feeling that once we get through the quarry and get to this dock area here is when we get to the Del Lago fight. At least in the original game, that's how it worked. You go to the church, go to the fish farm, or to the quarry, then the fish farm, then to the lake, then the Del Lago fight. It might be slightly different. We might have to go to the church area, to the quarry, maybe we go to the fish farm for something for the boat, and then we go to the lake. And then we fight Del Lago, and then we go to this area here to the right. What is this area? I believe this is possibly where we will eventually collect the piece that allows us to get into the church and get Ashley. It's also where Leon first gets off the boat, collapses, and has his nightmare about becoming infected with the Las Plagas. So other small things that we can make out from the map that I just want to comment on is that on the far left side, there's a indicator for levels on the map. So anything on a higher or a lower elevation needs to be cycled through, which should be pretty interesting. So something that's very easily noticeable as well is how there are a lot less typewriters around the map. So far, for the map that we do see, I can only count 4 typewriters. If you can find another, be sure to tell me. But, you won't be telling me because there are none else around the map that we can see so far. And there are only 2 merchant indicators. So it's possible that there are far less typewriters and far less appearances of the merchant than the original game, which will definitely make things more tense. So far, I have to say I'm pretty impressed with what we've seen. Nothing seems to be outright cut. More so just seems like it hasn't been shown off yet. So I think our worries of cut areas shouldn't be too extreme. I think we should all be pretty excited for what we haven't seen yet. I hope you enjoyed this analysis, and I hoped you were able to understand a damn word I was saying. I hope I was clear. I hope the visuals were clear. I hope you enjoyed the video, and all I can ask in return for you enjoying is just to subscribe. You don't need a like or comment unless you really want to. And if any future news comes out for Resident Evil 4 that I think hasn't been covered accordingly enough, I'll be sure to be right on top of it and talk about it. Yeah, I know someone already covered a good part of the map of Resident Evil 4, but that was that released while I was working on this one. I was already too far into it just to not finish this video. Stay tuned for more content, because there's surely more to come. Alright, see you around.